So, you started studying Mandarin maybe a few years ago or maybe even recently, but you took a break. Now you want to jump back in, but you're not really sure what should you start with. Go back to reading, practicing with friends, watching TV, listening to music. All of these are good ideas. But what you need to do first is to start again with your pinyin. Pinyin is going to be a really big help when you are trying to transition from not really practicing much or at least out of practice and you want to go back into more formal, more regular practice of Mandarin. You need pinyin. If you still need more convincing, and you might, on why pinyin is the one of the key things for you to get back into your studies, I'll give you a few reasons. So you've done pinyin before, probably, if you start from an English-speaking base and you're transitioning into Chinese. Even if you've done something old school like Wade Giles or done the Yale system, or if you've studied some Juyin as well, pinyin is still going to be first. What it's going to do is it's going to help you refamiliarize yourself with all the different sounds in Chinese, because there's a whole range, and if you don't speak Chinese normally, then, or if you don't hear it normally, then you're not going to sort of have all of these sounds at the ready for you. But maybe something more visual will help you see what I mean. So maybe as a really basic example, let's look at the notebook. You know what these say, if you can read pinyin. One is XI, one is SI. Well, you know that if you just know English letters. Okay, so I'm not going to add any of the tones yet, right? In Mandarin, 1, 2, 4. Because it's not really, that's the other thing pinyin obviously helps you with, is giving you a sort of a placeholder for the tones when you're spelling it out. But just looking at the actual spelling itself, you have to sort of reorganize how your mouth works. Your jaw, your tongue, your throat, everything you're doing with your mouth from English to Chinese, well, it needs adjustment. So this word, let's say we put a first tone on it, xi, and this tone, a first tone on it, this word, a first tone on it as well, si. So the XI versus the SI. For me, the XI sound I always sort of imagined as something of a smaller sh. Not exactly the SH sound you know from English, but sort of squeezing my jaw in a different way, making it chi smaller, almost like if there was a Y after this S. For the SH sound, taking the first tone again, sh, so we have xi, si, sh. And what I'm trying to get at is, if you do know some Chinese, right, you're somewhere along your beginner, intermediate, or intermediate level, you know that these sounds all exist separate of one another. They don't convey the same word, or they don't relate to the same word or character. But if you aren't fully familiar, or maybe I should say fully comfortable, with how you should be differentiating between the sounds when you're talking. So if you're trying to say something that is a word in Chinese that in pinyin has the X as the sound maker versus the S or the SH, but you're not able to visualize it or sort of categorize it for yourself in your own, in your own head, then that sort of leads to other problems down the line where you forget which word you were talking about in the first place. So it's great if you have a character for each word already, but a lot of times when you're learning things in Chinese just from friends and it's spoken, and especially if maybe someone who you're speaking with has an accent, then their sh sound could become very much s. And this is no particular fault, or rather, fault doesn't really help here. Because you want to be comfortable knowing when you're saying a word that makes your mouth do the xi sound. Xi, or if I write a little bit smaller, xian, xiang. Pardon my poor, deplorable handwriting. Versus something here, where you want to say shun, sheng, and even for S, I think there's a few less possibilities for when your mouth is making the motions to create the s sound in Mandarin. Of course, I've definitely brought this idea up to people, and some people mention, well, let's see, we have shi, si, shi, right? We're just borrowing the first tone right now to keep it simple. And now we have 3 characters. Shi, that's an awful looking shi. Si, shi. Why bother if I already have some grasp of Chinese and maybe I don't even want to learn to write them well? Or rather, writing isn't my focus, it's just speaking. So if I kind of just have an idea that this is a shi, a si, a shi, then why bother reviewing all of this romanized version of the Chinese? So if you know what the word is, how it sounds, right, you don't necessarily remember the character, or even if you don't really remember how you would spell it out in English letters for pinyin, but you know that, okay, I know shi, I know what it means, and then you start from there, and you go, okay, actually, I start to learn how to write it, now I know. I know what it looks like in actual Mandarin language, and I know how it sounds. Why bother refreshing something like the intermediate step? Well, it's precisely because it's the intermediate step. Pinyin was made to be this good stepping off point from English to Chinese, and actually also from Chinese back to English. Let's say, for example, you're using your phone and you do want to write out a word. Let's say you're just trying to say ni hao to someone on the phone. Oops, that is not an O. Okay, you're trying to say ni hao to someone on the phone. Well, you're going to have to write it out unless you can use bopomo for juin. So you're going to have to write it out like this. You need to be sure that you have the complete sort of vocabulary set. It's almost like a new alphabet in order to get out all of these characters from an English keyboard. I'll quickly round back again. I'm going to round back again to the sound part, though. So there's also the functionality of learning this for typing, for pleco, and typing on your phone or your computer, whatever your Chinese input system or wherever it shows up. But then something maybe I forgot to mention is the fact that when you first start to learn Mandarin, using pinyin to learn Mandarin, you say probably xi, xi, shi is here, and then this one would be si or si, I don't know, so I kind of forget at this point. Moving down here, how would you say this one? Just if you were just trying to read this sound, these letters to guess a sound. Ren, zhen. So you can sort of get by with that, right? If you're speaking some Chinese and let's say you want to say ren zhen, like to be earnestly doing something, ren zhen. But if you're saying ren zhen, anything like this, it's only passing. So you're only getting around the correct pronunciation and getting to sort of the same point. Rather than relearning and not just learning, but really practicing pinyin again and looking at the sounds so that you know that this is an I sound, this is an I sound, but when it's with an X, it's an E sound. Shi, si. Right, this is the one where you draw your tongue back in your mouth. I can't show you now, but I. And then same thing with this being almost like an R here. Shi, chi, something like that. And then here, you got to know that the Chinese R isn't the English R. The Chinese R is a bit of a R, where your tongue is sort of vibrating against part of the roof of your mouth. The ZH isn't, of course, Z, or it's not even a J sound, because there's already a J in pinyin. So all of this matters because you don't want to just get by. You want to get your Mandarin to a very good level. And you want to make the sounds right so you don't always sound like you're an outsider who's only trying to pick up on the correct pronunciation. And in all honesty, this kind of practice is probably equally, if not more useful, if you are living in a Chinese-speaking, community or country or area. So if we go back up here to these two words, try to pronounce them in your head. Try to pronounce this one, like, in Chinese, and try to pronounce this one. Can you tell the difference between the G at the end what does your mouth need to do to transfer from this sound to this one? Or maybe just not even transfer, just make a completely different sound. Can you make shun and sheng different? I would say a lot of my my Taiwanese friends, or even some of my Taiwanese relatives, cannot, and I mishear things, and I've actually started to pick up on this bad habit. Yeah, not a good habit. So this kind of practice is really going to be beneficial to you, especially if you're living in a place with locals, because just like in English or any language, locals tend to mess up parts of pronunciation, right? So same thing here. Ren, let's give it a fourth tone. Ren. See, there's the zh from the R, and then un is probably easier. But then adding this to rung. Same thing here. Let's give it a second tone. Zhen. I'm not even trying to think of words right now. I'm just trying to play with the pronunciation and the mouth movements for Chinese, for Mandarin. Zhen. Zheng. Zheng. Right? So tones aside, the no G to the addition of the G, they make a difference. If none of that was enough to convince you of the usefulness of pinyin in your when you re-enter Chinese studies, there's just the simple idea that practicing like this makes it habitual. So you're getting used to Chinese sounds again, no matter what. You're practicing maybe the English writing of it, so it's not your characters right now, but you're still making this sort of easier bridge between what you want to say in English, what you want to say in Chinese, and then something in between that sort of smooths the transition for how you picture it in your head and what you want to work with, how your mouth wants to work out the sound. So just making Chinese practice habitual again, doing it whenever you want to do your studies, and putting in the work for pinyin so that you have a solid foundation there and you can sort of hop off into the rest of your Chinese studies.